Have you been obsessing over something recently?
No, why? What do you mean?
I don't know. You seem to have a. I don't mean that in a bad way. It seems like you have the kind of brain that can really get into something, and that you kind of roam from one thing to the next when it suits your interest.
Well, I have actually been sort of reading up for this, the American Revolution. I mean, I know all about it for years and read around the topic on and off all sorts of times, but you know, just sort of boning up on the detail of it for this. And
Okay.
I actually used to have a bit of a love affair with Thomas Paine. Really interested in Thomas Paine. Got a massive book on his life. But that was years ago when I was sort of deeply interested in Thomas Paine. But because I've been sort of researching it for this conversation, I've sort of got into Thomas Paine a bit, common sense. So that's been interesting. But where I work for the Lotus Eaters and we do a new topic every week, I sort of have to read up or research about something and then just move on to the next thing. Which is good and bad. Is sort of, you can only go so deep. But where I've had a fair amount of time, I knew we were going to do this for a fair amount of time now. Apologies for how long it's taken to sort of make happen. But yeah, so I just been reading about this on and off for a few weeks now, and it's been fun. I really enjoy it. It's a great story, I think, especially for the Americans.
Well, what is it about Thomas Paine specifically that you dig?
Well, he was a rabble rouser. He was sort of he was never really cut out to be a statesman, though he tried later in life in France. But he was really a rabble rouser. He wrote polemics, something I aspire to do, maybe on some level, to write political polemics. Just try and speak the truth. I kind of hate the phrase, but speaking truth to power. That was really what Thomas Paine did, among other rabble rousers. People like Patrick Henry, but we'll get into it when we come to the individual things. Do you want to just kick off? Should we just start by just
Let's kick off. What do
it?
you have a year you want to start with, or a theme? How do you want to?
Well, that's an interesting question, really. Where do you start? Because we've bitten off quite a big chunk here. If we're going to talk about the entire Revolutionary War or War of Independence, it's quite a big chunk. So even given a couple of hours or so, I'll still have to sort of pick and choose and leave out lots of people. Whenever you tell a big story where there's dozens and dozens of figures and characters, and you can make an argument that they're all important in their own way. And if you've only got a couple of hours to play with, or not even that, then you're going to have to leave out quite a lot. There's so many battles. I mean, we'll only pick out the big ones, I'm afraid. If you look at a list, the other day I was looking at a list on Wikipedia of all the engagements, of all the battles, and there's so many. There's so many I've never even heard of. Lists and lists. And we'll only obviously be able to hit sort of the main ones. But well, where to start? One of the things I thought of saying was that wars often lead one into the other. They're not, completely isolated things usually. Historians will say that World War II is a direct consequence of World War One, and you could argue is a direct consequence of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which you could say after a century of hiatuses is somehow born out of the Napoleonic era, etc., etc., etc. So with the American Revolutionary War, or War of Independence, I'll have to make up my mind which I'm going to call it. Should really make up my mind, I guess, the War of Independence. You could certainly say that is born out of, in all sorts of ways, the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War happened a little earlier in the 1750s, 1760s. And that itself was born out of the War of the Austrian Succession. You can go on and on, you see, you keep going back further and further. But the 7 Years' War is really a war between some of the big powers in Europe, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain, etc. And it spilled out really all over the world. People have called the 7 Years' War the First World War in some ways, just in the sense that its conflicts did spread out all over the world. And America, the North American continent, wasn't spared from that. And so really the French and the English fought each other in the North American continent for the 7 Years' War, and quite often it's called the French and Indian War. Americans quite often refer to it the French and Indian War, which is just
Mhm.
the American theatre of the 7 Years' War. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that in detail, but the things to take away from that is that it cost the British a lot of money, fantastic amount of money, to win that war, keep that war going and win it. Fantastic amount of money, really. And the United States was, not the United States as we know it. It was the 13 colonies that belonged to the crown, that had their governors, and they were independent to a fairly large degree. Could set their own laws to some degree, could set their own taxation, and basically govern themselves. In order to protect them during the 7 Years' War, it cost a great deal of money. And so, in order to pay for that, the political overlords back in London, back in Whitehall, decided that they needed to, some of the American wars should really be financed, should really be paid for by the Americans themselves, because the American colonies had enjoyed for a long time a really quite low level of taxation. And so this is probably people that know things about the War of Independence probably know the phrase no taxation without representation. That's sort of one of the cornerstones, one of the keys of it all, is that the American colonists, I suspect modern Americans don't like that phrase. In our other conversation about the War of 1812, when I was referring to the states as colonies, there was a comment or two, people saying, stop calling them colonies. But anyway, at this point, they certainly were the 13 colonies. And they had got used to autonomy, really, almost complete autonomy. They didn't really, well, they certainly resented being ruled over by a parliament where their land and their people had no representation whatsoever. It's a fair enough gripe, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's not unreasonable, or not entirely unreasonable. So one of the first things that comes up if you watch a documentary or you listen to a lecture or something about this, they'll quite often mention the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was a piece of legislation passed by Parliament, which put a tax on all sorts of paperwork. Okay, whenever there was any sort of bureaucracy in the form of paperwork, it would require a stamp. This is just a bureaucratic administrative thing. It would literally not the stamp that you link and put on an envelope, but a stamp that you stamp paperwork with. It all needed to be formally stamped, and therefore you get the Stamp Act. And there was a small amount of taxation that went along with that. So in other words, Parliament was, well, as far as the American colonists were concerned, was sort of extorting money out of them unfairly. This was sort of a new tax, and they didn't like it. And so there was all sorts of political kickbacks over that. And to cut a long story short, because this is earlier, this is in the 1760s, in the end, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Now that's sort of significant, because Parliament doesn't usually allow itself to be bullied or browbeaten in any way. That sort of loathed to ever repeal things against their better judgment. But it was causing a real problem with commerce, because the Americans fairly quickly, within a year or so, decided to stop trading with Britain, with the mother country, as a protest against this Stamp Act. So it started hurting merchants in Britain, in London. And so they were able to put pressure on Parliament, say, look, this whole Stamp Act thing just isn't working. It's causing more trouble than it's worth. And so Parliament repealed that. But that does show a bit of weakness, doesn't it? It shows the Americans that if they put up a big enough resistance to something, it could work. Parliament isn't completely unbending. It can be sort of outmaneuvered sometimes. So quite often this Stamp Act is mentioned. Sorry, go ahead.
So often, or obviously, the Americans had leverage in the form, principally at this time, of commerce and economic leverage. That's basically the value that they had in this arrangement with the motherland.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean the New World, the Americas, sort of fantastically rich in a sense, in the sense of resource rich. Sort of essentially endless land and resources. Certainly at this point in we're talking about 1760s, 1770s, and into the 1780s, most of the North American continent is still unexplored, nearly. It's certainly it's unsettled, most of it. And so, yeah, it's sort of a fantastically rich prize. even though the average American isn't any more affluent, particularly than the average Frenchman or Englishman. Yes, the land America represents its ability to conduct commerce or its potential to conduct commerce is gigantic.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of goods that come down through the Hudson River and come out at New York Harbor, for example, is giant. Charleston in South Carolina is at the confluence of a couple of big rivers, and lots and lots of commerce comes down those rivers. And Charleston's one of the biggest ports at this point. Yeah, do you remember in our video about 1812 we talked about how New Orleans was fantastically important and rich? That too, but just not as much at this point in this slightly earlier generation. Charleston is sort of a big one, and there's some big engagements, big battles go down there. So yeah, that's why it's really valuable to everyone, certainly.
And just another clarifying question. Who is Parliament speaking to when they are communicating with the colonies? Is there one central governor? Is there like the shambles? Is it 13 different kind of states that they're dealing with, and then have individual interactions and I guess some sort of contractual agreement with each of these 13 little pies? Is that basically what's going on? There's no unified body that is representing or speaking on behalf of America to Great Britain at this point.
Yes, that's exactly it. There's 13 separate things.
Okay.
You can almost think of them as 13 separate countries, and it is this war that sort of puts an end to that, and people start thinking of themselves as Americans. So, for example, there's a great episode when the Continental Congress comes together, and at that point, that's when you've got sort of a central body, one central body that can sort of send communications back to England. But before that, you've got 13 separate ones with their own governors and everything. And there's a good episode where it is Patrick Henry himself, a Virginiaman, who says at one of the very early Continental Congresses, he says, I shall no longer think of myself as a Virginian. I shall think of myself as an American. And I invite everyone else to as well. So he says that, and it's like 1775 or 1776 even. So, right on the very, very cusp of the war. The war's already kicked off, you could argue, in some small ways, before Patrick Henry says that. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is on record, certainly in the earlier period, as describing himself as a Virginiaman. His country is Virginia. So yes, the nature of America is very different. And I suppose one of the things I'd like to say before we sort of kick off on the chronology and actual events and how they all played out, is this idea that the Americans had enough with taxation and had enough with Parliament and their English overlords, and just simply decided to be independent, and then they fought a war over that, which they eventually won. That's not really how it went. That's too simplistic. It didn't happen like that. The calls for independence came after the rebellion had begun. It began as sort of a revolt, a rebellion against taxation, against unfair treatment of various types, or against their loss of liberty. But it wasn't immediately about full independence from the crown. That came a bit later. And in fact, the most important leading men of the day, the main men, the 55 guys that made up the Continental Congress, they disagreed for a long time over whether they should be loyal or not. And all the way through the war, even years and years into it, there's vast swathes of the American population which are loyalists, or what they would call Tories. So it's quite a bitter thing that cuts the country. Not everyone is completely on board with being a rebel against the crown, essentially. It's not that the whole country just completely on board with it. It's quite a bitter struggle in many ways. So yeah, to answer your question, it's sort of 13 different bodies, at least to begin with, and it's not until they all come together in this Continental Congress, but then at that point, because the Continental Congress is sort of like a proto government, really. It's like a Congress, government historians after a while just start calling it Congress. It's not exactly the same as sort of your modern Congress. When these 55 men from the 13 colonies put bring all their delegates together in Philadelphia. There's no office of president, there's no Senate, there's no it's not a true Congress as we would know it today or anything like that. It's just these 55 guys. Sorry.
How were these guys selected? Or was it just resources or voluntary? Were they elected at all, or some were?
Yeah. I mean, these guys are mostly lawyers, usually. Mostly lawyers. You've got sort of the odd general. I mean, Washington is obviously a general, known as a career military man. But a lot of them are they're elected, yes, and they're sort of the leading men of each colony sends, 3 or 4 guys, and they're sort of just the leading men of their colony, usually lawyers. I mean, maybe John Adams is a good example. He was sort of a famous lawyer, prosecutor type, who was also sort of a local politician, and he's just sort of one of the leading men of Massachusetts. And so when it came to select sort of your top 3 or 4 guys to send to this Continental Congress, he wins it, and I think that's a fair example. It's that sort of thing. But it is interesting, isn't it, in certain times in history when a body of men, usually men, get together and just declare themselves a sovereign body. You know, I'm thinking maybe of like the Chinese Communist Party under Mao in '48, just sort of declaring themselves, we're just the government now. Or maybe the Long Parliament in the English Civil War, just declaring that sovereignty lies with us now. The cockpit of power is here now. We've just declared that, and you have to fight for your life to keep it. But it's funny how that goes.
You're speaking about Adams being an example of a lawyer or barrister that came up. So is there like a supreme, on the level of law, is there a Supreme Court in Britain that decides law for these colonies, or are the colonies building their entire law structure on their own and probably importing things from the British tradition, but they're building things, they already have the sovereignty of, prosecution and execution and lawsuits, and they're self-governing already on the basis of law, not necessarily on the basis of economics or on the basis of some sort of sovereignty before they declare that, but the infrastructure for self-governance is already in place.
Yes, absolutely. The infrastructure for self-governance is already in place. Yeah, I mean, there's no Supreme Court in England. There is now, but that was only in the last 20 years or so. There wasn't back then. No such thing. The Parliament itself is the highest body that makes law, that makes all legislation. So yeah, and of course, technically, all the American colonies are subject to the law of Parliament. That's an interesting thing. King George III, who is the king throughout this whole period, he considers, obviously his view, his opinion is quite strident, but he considers everyone in America to be Englishmen. They're all Englishmen, they're all his subjects, and as such should behave themselves and adhere to any and all acts of Parliament. So yes, nominally they're supposed to behave under any and all English law. But on top of that, they've got their own government. So the government of the Carolinas, for example, could make up their own legislation about how they're going to tax things, and so they can have that sort of level of law or bureaucracy placed over the top. So yeah, that's sort of how it works. But yeah, when the colonists decide that certain acts of Parliament are sort of beyond the pale, or they just sort of refuse to abide by them, then things start getting a bit sticky. And it is interesting, I think, that that the Americans were so, perhaps what's the right word, that were so full of confidence to do that, because there's lots of colonial possessions all around the world, not just British ones, all sorts of European possessions all around the world, and not many of them, hardly any of them, have got this sort of sense of confidence, a sort of a strident self-belief in their own destiny. I mean, it's too early to be using the phrase manifest destiny. It's far too early for that. However, there is a sense of that. I mean, Thomas Paine talks about it in Common Sense, that there's that America is full of like potential. It's absolutely full of potential, and we don't need to be afraid to stand up to the Crown and England. You know, that's one of the things. It's one of the key points. And one of the things I might just say right away, or early in the discussion for the viewers, for your viewers, like, why is this? Who is this goddamn Limey to be telling us about American history? I would just like
you're gonna throw down your qualifications
to re-point out that I am an Anglo-American. My father is an American, and so I feel like if I am I can sort of speak about it a bit, being American, having many American cousins, and being there many times. And of course, this story is, you know, ultimately glorious for the Americans, and ultimately embarrassing or humiliation or just a defeat, really, just an L in the column for the English, of the British rather. So yeah, although it does swing back and forth a fair bit, it's not sort of nothing's inevitable. You know, it goes on for quite a while, talking 5-6 years of hostilities, and a couple more than that even, depending on how you count it, when treaties were signed and different things. But yeah, sorry, you've got a...
So just to get kind of a grip on the overarching beginning of this independence. So you're saying that they're not theorizing about independence. They are principally concerned with fairness and unfairness, and they begin to resist or rebel specific things from Parliament. They say, no, we're not going to do that. And then battles start to break out where the sovereignty of the British Empire is trying to force its will on these petulant resisting settlers, right?
Yeah.
So does that how it kind of starts, like these little kind of conflicts here and there about like issues, but also actual battles over issues and over land, or how does it start to become violent and edge into that?
Yeah, great. So it's sort of a gentle trickle towards sort of large-scale open conflict. Is there's sort of a trickle over a few years, but there's a few incidents, sort of fairly famous incidents. I mean, there's the Boston Massacre, for example, where in Boston there was the English soldiers are always sort of resented. You know, I think wherever you go in the world, almost whatever time period you're talking about, when there's a foreign army occupying the streets, even if they're not really doing anything, they're just patrolling, they're trying to keep peace, if anything, it's still usually heavily resented, sort of armed soldiers on the streets. And so, yeah, where there were British soldiers sort of legitimately, legally, on the streets of Boston, this one day there was just a lot of hostility towards this particular small group of men, and a mob, a crowd of people became more and more belligerent towards this very small number of English soldiers in the middle of Boston, and someone fired a shot. Often that happens in history. Someone fires a shot, and we never find out who. But someone fired a shot, and a few people, was it even one person or a small number of people were killed at the Boston Massacre by English troops, and there was a whole law case about it. John Adams himself was involved in the law case, but it's just episodes like that, more than one episode sort of along those lines, where it doesn't sort of cause the American colonies to rise up in full-scale revolt all the way from Georgia to Montreal, but it's not forgotten. Things like that are not forgotten, because you could argue that it's just murders are happening there. I think it springs to mind sort of Northern Ireland, English troops, British troops on the streets of Northern Ireland, supposed to be sort of keeping the peace, but in fact are a touch point for violent things to go down themselves. So yeah, there's the Boston Massacre, and of course the Boston Tea Party is a famous one, isn't it? Nearly everyone knows of the Boston Tea Party, because after the Stamp Act was repealed, Britain decided, as the British government often does, is that we'll just go round another way. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Over the next few years, we'll just sort of kind of quietly, surreptitiously introduce other smaller taxes, and we'll still tax them. We'll still get the money we want, but we'll just try and do it under the radar. So they did it in various other ways. And in the end, one of them was that it was going to be on tea. And the people down at Boston Harbour it pissed them off. So they physically chucked lots and lots of tea, tons of tea, into the sea.
Do you know if the tea was produced in America? Was it produced in America? Or is that from India somehow?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was. I don't think it was. Actually, I should know that. But I can't remember. Man. I don't think it was. I believe it was being imported into America, and they had to pay an import tax. It might be completely the other way around. But either way, there was a tax that they really resented on the tea. Yeah.
So, you gave me a vision from the Life of Brian, where the Judeo Liberation Front, or the People's Front of Judeo Liberation, or whatever, they're arguing about what have the Romans done for us? That comedy scene, and people say it was side roads and running water and trash in the streets. What have the Romans done for us? It doesn't seem that the British Crown and the governing body is giving much or is supplying much. What is the quid pro quo for the taxation that's put upon America? Are they given technology? Are they given security in the form of protection from France or something? Like what is America getting back in return? And if you talk about fairness, there certainly does seem to be an imbalance, but was there something that the Crown was bequeathing America?
Well, there was the aqueducts.
Okay.
Always built the aqueducts. No, I'm joking. That's Life of Brian, isn't it?
I don't remember any of the aqueducts.
There is They did build the
in
aqueducts
Philadelphia.
But yeah, no. I mean, well, security is one of the things. I mean, that does sound a bit like a mafia boss, doesn't it? It does sound like gangsterism a bit when you say that. But yeah, like I say, there's the 7 Years' War, where Britain sort of fought a war. In order to protect, in inverted commas, the colonies from invasion from the French. Commerce is a two-way thing, isn't it? It makes everyone rich, or should, in theory at least, that's the idea. So, I mean, what were they getting from the Crown other than sort of guaranteed peace?
And that's offshore too. It's mostly naval security at this point.
Well, yes, because the American
they're not being protected from
the almost non-existent. Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry, they're not being protected from the Native Americans and the hostilities there. Speaking of the colonies, I assume, have to deal with the conflicts with everything in the continent. But I guess every threat from Europe is supposed to be dealt with by the Crown. Is that kind of basically, it's a one-sided security?
Yeah, I mean, more in the northern states, sort of the New England states, there's the Iroquois Indians that would usually fight against the Americans one way or another, whether it's with the French or later in this story with the English against the Americans. They make the calculation that their bitterest sort of first enemy is the Americans first and foremost, rather than the English or the French. So yeah, the colonies do have sort of a tense relationship with the Native Americans.
And the Crown isn't necessarily helping them with that. So I'm just trying to case out, how is the Crown deserving of the loyalty of the colonies, other than, I guess, in name and in spirit, through being subject to a king, which does have a certain amount of power and over people, at least at that time.
Yeah, it's a good question, a really good question. I've never really had that put to me before. I think maybe the answer is more that it just wasn't framed in those terms at that point. I don't think the governors of the colonies, take for example the governor of Massachusetts or something, or the governor of Virginia, they would always be staunch royalists. They were given their position by the Crown, and so they were nearly always staunch loyalists. Most most people, it seems, it depends which historian you read, which account you read, but it seems there was lots and lots of people in the colonies that were completely loyal to Britain, to the crown. It was a type of madness to them that anyone would dream of breaking away. Why would we do that?
It's a foundational aspect of the identity, but also the power structures that are facilitated by the bequeathal of positions of power too. So it's reinforced by bequeathals. I'm sorry, that's not the right word. Of like governorships, patronage. But it's an identity issue, and so that. Going back to what you said earlier, the tensions about loyalists versus the rebels or the independents, that comes from a lot of the people in the positions of power have it built into their identity as subjects to the crown. It's just kind of part of who they were up until things start to get a little shaky with the violence and then probably pressure and diversity of thought with regards to the identity of an American or a colonist.
Yes, and I mean, maybe I haven't even stressed this enough, but so for example, George Washington himself, appointed to be the head of the armies at one point. We'll get into the chronology of it. Just before sort of big scale open hostilities break out, he still hopes Washington himself still hopes that it won't come to armed conflict and there'll be some sort of resolution with Britain. Most of the Continental Congress, even up to when they're debating the Declaration of Independence, have to be cajoled round, have to be convinced. So you've got certain people that are really for it. So John Adams, for example, and Patrick Henry, two examples of people that were really, really up for independence, full independence from really early on. They'd seen their militias killed by British regulars, and they knew that it was on. They knew that this was sort of a life and death, skull-crushing conflict was going to happen. You know, and yet there were still lots of people, even within the Continental Congress, that just they hated the idea of having to have battles with English soldiers and to have to well once they declare independence, they're outlaws. They would be hung. If the crown got them, they would all be hung. So it's a very serious thing. And this idea that as soon as Britain starts issuing unfair taxes, everyone just wants to be independent. It didn't really happen like that. It took a long time, many years really, of different things playing out. And even after it all started kicking off, there were still divisions within the American side of things, quite deep ones. I mean, even towards the end of the war, even in the last years of the war, more in the South, in the southern theatres, in the Carolinas, whole families are ripped apart because they couldn't decide, father fighting son, because some were loyal to the crown and some weren't. Some were patriots. Often it's sort of loyalists versus patriots, they often say.
Okay, that's the framing.
Sometimes,
interesting. Okay.
Or sometimes Tories versus Whigs, they would say. Tories being loyal to Britain and the Whigs.
Do you know why Whig? Why they call it Whig? Is it some dude named Alexander Whig came up with the word or something?
No, well, it's a difficult term because today the word Whig can be used as sort of a cover term for other things. But originally, way back then, there was a Whig faction in Parliament. I'm talking even hundreds of years before what we're talking about. So Robert Walpole, was he sort of the first important Whig politician? Anyway, just like in any other parliament, you've got sort of different parties. You know, you've got the Republicans and the Democrats, and nowadays we've got the Tories, or Conservatives, and Labour Party. Well, back in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, you had the Tory Party and the Whig Party. Where the actual word comes from, I'm not entirely sure. There was no person called Whig. Where does it come from? I did know at one point, but I can't remember, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, I'm running into like
wearing wigs on your head. Or there was
because it's got
Sir
the
John
H in
Wig
there. It's a Whig. Here.
Yeah, I mean, you might be able to just look it up real quick where it comes from. But a few other sort of things to mention before it sort of really kicks off. You know, you've got the things like the Boston Tea Party, and lots of men sort of started coming together in groups to talk about and to organise any sort of resistance that might be necessary against Britain, if Britain decided to clamp down, if they decided to send in regiments, sort of regular foot regiments of foot, then they would need to organise and sort of create militias, really. There've been Minutemen militias, certainly up in Massachusetts way, and they created what they called committees of correspondence, which is fairly loose-knit communities, or maybe not even all that loose-knit, but communities of like-minded people that organised together to pull off things like the Boston Tea Party, and where there were sort of arch loyalists in various places that were getting in the way of things. Again, sort of the cliche is, or the oft mentioned thing is, that you get tarred and feathered. Maybe there was like an important magistrate who was a loyalist. Instead of just murdering them, because that is really quite violent, isn't it? Instead of doing that, they just sort of humiliate them, and tarring and feathering happened a fair bit. And so it's organised things like that, to get sort of whole towns to be on side with forming mobs, things like that.
So it's very emergent then. It's very ground up. It's very grassroots.
Yes, I think that's a fair thing to say. It sort of played out differently all over the place, though, to be fair. So, for example, sort of Massachusetts and New England, the more northern states, in the beginning part of the War of Independence anyway, are a lot more gung-ho about everything. They're a lot more up for it. So the delegation at the Continental Congress from Massachusetts are much more roaring to go, whereas the guys from Virginia are like, well, no, let's hold on, let's think about this, because the war hadn't really come to their doorstep yet. And so, some of the first things that happen is when Parliament decides that they are going to have to do something about this. They don't immediately decide to send over a giant army or a giant armada. They think that it might be able to be put down relatively easily. So where there's a handful of regiments already in the New World, they send over a few more, like 4 more regiments or something, which isn't, a fantastic amount of men or anything. It ramps up again, like I say, over sort of a few years. But one of the first sort of actions is at Lexington Green, or sometimes people just say Lexington. Have you heard of that one? Or Concord? The battles at Lexington and Concord, 2 different actions, but really close to each other in time, and quite often get mentioned almost in the same breath. But yeah, I mean, the British Army end up meeting some of these militiamen at a place called Lexington Green, and there's a firefight, and a few men die. I think like 8 or 10 Americans, militiamen, are killed, and a very small number of English soldiers. But after that, the sort of surrounding militias hear of this, and they come out in force, and they end up chasing the British Army back from Concord, and that it's sort of a fighting retreat for the English, and something more in the order of 70 or 80 English soldiers are killed, and another sort of 150 or 170 odd are captured. So that's a fairly serious thing, isn't it? That's not small numbers now. That sounds like you can only really imagine that was sort of a fairly desperate set of firefights going on there, that many people were killed. And so those 2 actions at sort of Lexington Green and Concord are sort of considered as sort of really the opening salvos, the opening shots of the American War of Independence.
That's kind of when the handkerchief drops at that point. Yeah. That's kind of like, or the glove or whatever it is. It's kind of on at that. It's like there's no more like petty things. It starts to ramp up, maybe.
Oh no, definitely. So like the hawks in the Congress, people like John Adams are saying, look, this is what the English are like. This is what they're going to do when it comes to it. They'll send in men. So let's stop pussyfooting around here. Let's get a bit serious. Let's sort of spend some money on our men. Let's appropriate some funds to sort of make a proper army, or a Continental Army. That's what they wanted. That's what guys like Adams and Jefferson, and even Ben Franklin, they realised we need an army. These sort of 13 different militias from the different states are not really going to cut it We need sort of a central command. We need sort of a central body for ordnance and for clothes, issuing clothes to the men, all things like this. We need a sort of decent amount of administration and bureaucracy in place, and none of it exists. And so, well, one of the first things they need to do is nominate a leader of the army. And I mean, this is where George Washington himself comes into it, sort of the great man, the great figure. And you have to be a little bit careful with people that are figures in history that are sort of as famous as that, because quite often there's so many sort of layers of romance, for want of a better word, that to get down to the real man, the real individual, is quite difficult. I think George Washington suffers from that. I think that's fair to say. That there's so much. There's so much wrapped up in his personality, or what he represents, that to get down to the real man is a difficult thing. But nonetheless, he was nominated to be sort of the leader of this Continental Army, and it's in a terrible shape. I mean, we said even in our video about on 1812 that there was no standing army. That's in 1812. So back in 1775, 1776, of course, there was no standing army. A lot of the founding fathers thought, people like Jefferson, they thought that a standing army was a terrible thing. It was sort of an evil thing, because it would inevitably become the tool of some faction or other, and would be used to the wrong ends. And it was far better for society, for the world, if there were no standing armies. That was how they thought about it. Even in 1812, I mean, John Quincy Adams, he made a big speech about how bad it is to have sort of standing armies, and it's not really the American thing to do, to have large standing armies.
This Continental Army is more of a kind of a pickup army kind of thing. It's just ad hoc. It's a temporary thing. We're going to do this specifically for this one purpose, and then it's only granted a temporary kind of legitimacy. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, yeah, it's sort of the idea. It's certainly not fully 100% permanent and indefinite. No. So Washington is given this command, and his command is either until he's relieved of it or until he wins the war. So that's his command. And then the men under him, often, nearly always, it's said, sign 1-year contracts to stay in the army. So it's all very legal. But 1-year contracts aren't very good, especially if you're fighting a multi-year war. So nothing's sort of written in stone forevermore. This is just the US Army forevermore now going forward. No, it's not that. But it is for as long as it's need be. I mean, everything's so brand new, and they're trying everything for the first time. This Continental Congress is kind of unprecedented, and what they're doing is unprecedented. So they're sort of finding their feet as they go. And there's actually lots of problems with how Congress will give a command and then ask them to do a certain task, and then they're incapable of doing it because they're not given enough provisions, they're not given enough warm clothes. Lots and lots and lots of times, even years into this war, the army is described as sort of not having enough shoes and things like that, and that they're stinking and that they're dying from disease. Let alone got enough gunpowder for things. So all the way through this war, right up to the very end, the American army, the Continental Army, is sort of really badly suffering from lack of funds, a lack of real concrete results coming from Congress. They speak a big game. They say they're going to give them lots of money and provisions and things. And it never really seems to get to the front line. Or rarely. So that is a big problem for the Americans. They're constantly battling against that.
Speaking of, just to flesh out the story a little bit more, if the South is needing to be persuaded to, that the British are a threat to their autonomy, how are they? How does that progress? That the Southern colonies, cast in lots with the Northern colonies, and kind of decide that they are America too, or they are a part of this project, this identity.
Yeah, well, it's just a hard-fought war of words, really, I suppose, is the answer to that. It's not that the southern states were completely against the idea of independence. They were just slightly less. It was sort of a slightly less immediate concern for them, but only slightly, I would say.
Okay.
So yeah,
So
when
the
it comes
British were
down
still
to it,
putting pressure on the southern colonies too, that the southern colonies resented.
yeah, well, absolutely, yeah, yeah. So something like, for example, the Stamp Act, that applied to all of them, all of the states. So yeah, I think it's just that uh, their will to fight was just slightly less than the New England states, but not by much. I mean, well, I say that it did come down to sort of quite close votes sometimes in the Continental Congress, quite close votes on whether they're going to do this or that, or whether they're going to sort of give or vote money for certain people and certain states to do all different things, and the different arguments about whether they're going to increase the size of their navy and all sorts of that. It's a back and forth, and yeah, it is actually quite close sometimes. It comes down to sort of just one or two votes sometimes here and there. But the main one, the main vote on whether they should really create their Continental Army and have a declaration of independence is the whole Congress isn't completely on board with it. There is sort of quite a lot of backroom dealings and having to convince specific people which way they should vote. And out of it comes sort of some of the more famous leading lights of the revolution. So people like Jefferson and John Hancock and John Adams, people like this, and Madison himself. Yeah, because their side of the argument, I suppose you could say, won. That they go on to become sort of the most important figures in it. So, for example, Benjamin Franklin, his own son, he was very, very close to his son, extremely close. His son, when his son was growing up, he was sort of inseparable from him. And yet, when the War of Independence broke out, and son William, I think he was William, was a grown man and had an important position of his own, they disagreed. Obviously, Benjamin Franklin was an arch patriot, but his son was a loyalist, and so they fell out over it, and they sort of fought on different sides. And so you can see there that even in the household of Benjamin Franklin, it was sort of ripped apart by this. People didn't agree on it a lot, and you end up with sort of, well, again, a bit later in the story, really civil war. So there's some wars in history where everyone's sort of on board, and there's others where it rips society down the middle. So, for example, again, I'm thinking of the English Civil War, or maybe even the American Civil War in some places. Families disagreed within the family which side to be on. And then I think of maybe World War II in America. You didn't have to convince many Americans to be against the Japanese in 1942, right? There weren't many households ripped apart by where their loyalties lie. So
well,
wars can be
Germany
very
was probably another matter too, and then World War
It's
I.
actually, it's interesting. I was reading a thing just the other day about what a giant German population there was in America during World War One, just before World War One. And when Woodrow Wilson got them into World War One, there were lots of German language newspapers and things in America. There's giant German population there. But anyway, that's a different story. This one happens to be that it did cause a rift in even like inter household. So let alone the entire nation or all the colonies. Someone said this sort of a famous thing that only a small number of people ever really fought for independence. Out of the whole population that there is, or all the men that were of fighting age, out of all of them, only a small number, like 10% or something, ever actually took up arms and did something about it. And so, I mean, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That a relatively small percentage of a population can, in fact, sway everything for everybody, can move history even, without being too grandiose about all of this.
Well, I mean, you could compare and contrast that to World War II, where it was very top down, but everybody was deployed in the war effort for World War II in America, or it was a part of the culture for several years where everybody was sacrificing and everybody was either being conscripted and going off to war or working at home to facilitate the war. It was a much larger involvement for the entire country rather than what you're saying with these colonies. It was just kind of like this Continental Congress, and are they only issuing war orders about this war, and are they only concerned primarily with their relationship with the British Crown? Are they thinking about how do we govern at home? Are they even thinking about how they govern at home as a governing body yet? I mean, I guess that leads up to the Constitution. That's when they start thinking about, well, what are we for? As opposed to at the beginning, they're all there to be against something, basically, more or less, or to be, to resist the crown and its overthrow.
Yeah, well, no, it's a good question. And that does touch upon something I sort of hinted at earlier, where it starts off as this sort of rebellion against the crown, but not necessarily anything like full independence. And then of course, by July 1776, they're there. And so you said something else there. What was your question about? Could you just reiterate that question slightly? Because there's more than one point I wanted to make about it.
Just the Constitution of the
that's it. Sorry, I do remember now.
Congress.
So at some point it became truly it became a movement for full independence. Now, what comes after full independence? You need a government in place, don't you?
Yeah.
So you obviously the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, but that's a lot later. I mean, that's sort of what is the Bill? The Constitution is 1787, I think. So that's way after. That's a fair few years after this, because this sort of comes to a head by 1781, and by 1782, 1783, the Brits are completely gone. And it's not till 87, I believe, I might be wrong about that, I should know off the top of my head, but I think about 87 is when you've got the Constitution. So you can see right there the chronology of things, the way it goes, the idea of how exactly what America will be, exactly their nature of government, isn't worked out until quite a few years after this. However, having said that, when the Continental Congress first came together, they created a thing called the Articles of Federation, which is sort of like an early sort of proto constitution in a way. And so anyway, they were able to sort of use the Articles of Federation, as a basis, some sort of legal basis to, as I say earlier, when men get together and just decide that their cabal will be a sovereign body now. They just decide that's just what it is. And so, so the Articles of Federation, sort of the important thing that sort of covers that. But no, it's a good question, because you would think, well, if you declared independence, surely you've got all the machinery of government ready to go. Well, no, that's not the case. I mean, again, maybe it's not a great analogy, but just thinking about the war in Iraq, the second war in Iraq, where they do away with the last regime, but there's nothing in place to replace it, not in the immediate. That's sort of for further down the road, and that's not always the best way to do things, of course.
Well,
but in this example,
often
it would work
fails.
out okay. Sorry?
Yeah, somehow it works out okay for America. America is kind of unique, at least at that time, for pulling this off. Not just for revolting, but actually working itself into a fully sovereign state. Which, like we said in 1812, it even takes a long time after the Constitution is written for it to really kind of become a world power and a sovereignty fully. But at that point, taking the step of declaring, no, Dad, go away, is totally different than moving out and building your own house and starting your own family, the whole process of that. And I just wanted to ask one thing when you brought up the Articles of Federation. We know that there's the Federalist Papers, which is this, and there's the Anti-Federalist Papers too, but there's this huge debate before the Constitution that's kind of over the Articles of Federation. When does that happen? Does that happen during the war, or does that pick up in earnest after things kind of settle with the British? Are you
what exactly? You mean just the push towards sort of a fully realised concept of government?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The argument over that doesn't really pick up until after the immediate threat or the immediate issue over British rule is kind of dealt with. Is the Articles of Federation just kind of shambled together
Oh no, no, it's an
and
incredible
then fleshed
document.
out?
No,
Okay.
yeah, no, it's an incredible document. I mean, it's all very you know, it's thought out. Yeah, the sort of the debate had already gone on for many years, and it had gone on in other ways as well. I mean, the American founding fathers didn't come up with most of what they said out of nowhere, out of whole cloth. Quite often they're relying on sort of earlier generations writing. But well, maybe one example perhaps is you've got the writings of Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and people like Thomas Paine, I've heard it said, would draw sometimes quite heavily on the writings, political writings of people from the English Civil War, which is, you know, a long time before. There's a guy
Okay.
called Freeborn John in the English Civil War, a chap called Freeborn John. Freeborn John wrote, again, sort of political polemics against tyranny and in favour of liberty. And you can see echoes of that sort of thing in the American War of Independence, that sort of the idea of the Tree of Liberty, and all that sort of thing, and being sort of anti-monarchical. I mean, and some even say that the American founding fathers drew heavily from even sort of Roman republicanism, that they
Yeah.
idolized people like Cincinnatus. You know, Cincinnati is named after the Roman Cincinnatus, sort of a paragon of republicanism. And you know, a lot of their architecture, a lot of your architecture is very Romanesque. Um, And so, yeah, the founding fathers took inspiration from all sorts of places, actually. And you're quite right, absolutely right, that America is almost sort of a unique example, almost, of when this worked. This idea that a nation that is as yet unborn can just sort of realize itself into being.
Yeah.
That's been tried dozens or hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times throughout history, and very, very, very rarely works, and very even more rarely is a blinding success, as the
Yeah.
United States has been. So it's incredible. I mean, we look at the French Revolution, where there's lots and lots of parallels there, including Thomas Paine himself getting involved. Lots and lots of parallels with the French Revolution, which is shortly after, very shortly after the American Revolution, and
Yeah.
that famously fails. You know, collapses into just a complete bloodbath and insanity. So what the Americans were able to do, what the founding fathers were able to do, is really quite an incredible achievement. And well, I think, even as an Englishman, I think it's great and a noble thing.
So there's this intellectual discussion or this kind of theoretical discussion about governance and about identity, fomenting for a long time before the actual rebellion and blows come to blows, so that the the violence and the resistance isn't an end to itself. It's part of a continuum of building this project that nobody really understands what they're doing. I mean, nobody knew that they're founding the United States of America until they kind of founded it. Nobody, Thomas Paine doesn't know where it's headed, right? And then the violence comes, and then they get back to work figuring out all these ideas. And there's this long, huge discussion going on and it's not just about resisting an oppressive or an unfair government. It's about really deeply rethinking the identity of what we're doing here and how government operates and what tyranny is and what democracy is, and then all the Enlightenment ideas are also taking root at that time over in Scotland and being imported at the time too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's all wrapped up in the age of the Enlightenment, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, people like Thomas Jefferson are considered sort of, I've already used the word, but a paragon of sort of the Enlightenment. Sort of these people like Benjamin Franklin as well, very much sort of Renaissance men. They're like
Yeah.
polymaths. They're sort of good at many, many different things, sort of great minds. That's sort of a very Enlightenment thing to do or to aspire towards. Yes, and there's this idea of in the Enlightenment of sort of throwing off the ancient regime, is it's often called, i.e., sort of kings, sort of monarchical cults, doing away with those. Yeah, that's very much sort of at the heart of things that Thomas Paine would write, or people like John Adams would aspire towards. Yes, this idea that, again, like the Republican Romans, the idea that a king is a dirty word, and that we can do without kings. Yeah, that whole idea.
Which is a hard sell for loyalists. It's a hard sell for people who kingship is a part of their identity, their political identity. It's not a given at that point. Right now, in this age, it's kind of a given that we don't want a king and that we call anybody who aspires to that a fascist, right? It's like kind of this evil ruler, top-down authoritarian ruler for us, at least speaking, probably not so much in Europe as it is for us Americans. But at that time, it was not cut and dry. There was a lot of people in America who I assume thought that they could forward some sort of American cause in conjunction and maintain some sort of maintain a relationship to the sovereignty of Britain and not have to be independent, from what I gather you're saying.
Yeah, lots of people, and well, as I said earlier, it's a crime, it's a high crime, it's traitorous to have declared independence. The people responsible for that really should be hung as far as the Crown is concerned. And so, yeah, lots of people in America, I mean, vast swathes of the nation, thought that it was just disloyal. You know, if George III thought of them as Englishmen, albeit on the other side of an ocean, they're still Englishmen. Well, a lot of Americans thought that about themselves as well. As I say, George Washington himself, just before hostilities kicked off, he redesigned a flag. He redesigned the American flag, and it was the 13 stripes, like you've got now, representing the 13 colonies. And in the corner where you've now got stars, there's a Union Jack there. So even in George Washington's mind, there was still going to be some sort of symbiosis between America and England. Yeah, this idea of a complete and utter break with the Crown, and we'll be completely our own sovereign country. Yeah, it took a while and a lot of persuasion before they got there. So yeah, in the run up to, well, the 4th of July 1776 is sort of the very end of a set of goings on. You know, a lot of discussion has already been had by that point. You know, I keep mentioning Thomas Paine and the Common Sense, but apparently that particular pamphlet, and it's only sort of, I think, 30 or 40 pages long, depending on how it's printed, so it's not all that long, but that would have, they say that sort of got a fantastic amount of traction, that hundreds of thousands of people read that, and extrapolating for those times, that's millions of people in modern days would have read that. So it's it did enjoy a large distribution. And then when things, after the first summer of fighting and there's the first winter,
what year is this?
Well, the winter of 76 to 77. Thomas Paine writes another pamphlet, another treatise called American Crisis, I think it was called, where again he's saying, you know, we've got to fight now, though. It's all very well to be high-minded and talk about the Tree of Liberty and to talk about fighting against tyranny and things, but now we've got to actually do it. We need people for the army. I mean, he talks about people that would only fight sort of fair weather or summer soldiers, he called them, and sunshine patriots. We need more than just sunshine patriots. We need people that are prepared to stick it out through the winter and things. So yeah, Thomas Paine, although he never became a politician as such in America, his contribution is big. I mean, his life is a fascinating one. He ended up going over to France during the French Revolution in the 80s, in the 1780s, and getting involved in that. So he's a fascinating figure. But after the actions sort of kick off, I mentioned Lexington and Concord. One of the big ones is, have you heard of Fort Ticonderoga?
No.
There's a place called Fort Ticonderoga, and it's a really important fort on the Hudson. Is it on the Hudson River? Yeah, it must be, I think. Anyways, it's really important, and it's strategically important. It's sort of Gibraltar-like, I've heard it described. In other words, it's relatively easy to defend and very hard to take. and it's in a sort of a really quite key position. And at that time, the English had been using it as sort of an ammo dump, or there was lots of artillery there. There was lots of really good things that an army would want. And the Americans take it without a shot. They move some artillery up to some high ground overlooking it, and it surrenders. And that's a really bad humiliation. The English commander in the whole of the American theatre is General Gage, Thomas Gage, and that's a humiliating thing to have happened to him. That Fort Ticonderoga was taken more or less without a shot fired. It's a very well defended. In theory, it should be a very well defended fort, and that was taken. So that was sort of one of the opening shots where the English realise, the British, sorry, keep saying English, I mean British. They realise, oh, actually, we need to be a bit more serious about this. We're going to need to send over a load more guys. This isn't going to be just a one summer thing. This isn't just a few pissed off citizens that we can sort of bully into going home and giving up the cause. No, it's a lot more than that. We're looking at sort of a full-scale rebellion, and and sort of some serious measures have to be taken.
Okay. So who do they put in charge of this when they decide to get serious?
Who?
British.
The English?
Yeah.
It's this general I mentioned, General Gage, to begin with. The English actually go through a fair few different commanders on the ground, and they get replaced. Because, as I say, conflict goes on for sort of 5-6 years, and there's sort of 3 or 4, depending on how you want to count it, different guys that are sort of in command on the ground. But to begin with, it's Gage, General Gage. He gets replaced relatively quickly, within a year or two. One of the things to mention is that, I already mentioned, but the Continental Congress meet in Philadelphia. So it's sort of Philadelphia is the capital, if you like. It's one way of saying it. Again, in our 1812 video, we mentioned how they only moved the capital to Washington and sort of built Washington, D.C. from scratch almost. And that's only in sort of the 1810s, beginning in the 1810s. Or ever so slightly before. So if we're talking about the 1770s, it's all very sort of fly by wire. It's all sort of on the hoof. It's all sort of cobbled together a bit. But Philadelphia is becomes sort of undisputedly the seat of government for this sort of fledgling nation. I mean, there's no president or anything. Remember, they don't elect a president until after it's all over. There's no many houses of government or anything like that. It's just sort of this one building, Liberty Hall, with just, as I say, just 55 guys, or to begin with 55. It's all very small scale. It's all very sort of held together with baling wire and Scotch tape. It's all very So
the Continental Congress issues orders, and then George Washington basically just executes their will to the best of his ability. Is that kind of basically the structure? That's the only executive. He's basically the executive branch at this point, and that's only with regards to the standing army. That's kind of like this rolling standing army that they're having a difficult time getting people to even stay in, let alone for an entire summer, just for a year contract at a time. So is that basically kind of the setup at this point?
Basically, yeah. One thing that you mentioned, basically desertions. Desertions are massive. People are just deserting all the time. But yeah, everything you said there was right, other than you just mentioned the executive wing of government. So yeah, you're exactly right that the Continental Congress issue Washington with orders, essentially, or they give him a command with orders, and he's just left to fulfill them. But he's not the executive arm of government. There's sort of explicitly.
But he's the closest thing to it.
Yeah, I mean, a commander in the field, he's got the power of life and death. Yeah. Maybe now might be a good time just to mention Washington's style of leadership and things. He was known as an authoritarian. He was really quite strict. Well, when he first took over the army, when he first gets there, he says, "Oh, I would never have taken this commission if I realised what an absolute state the army is in. It's not really an army. It's just a ragtag group of guys that are barely clothed and are sort of half diseased, and certainly are not trained, certainly don't know anything about drill or anything, and that their morale is extremely low, and that their officer corps is ridiculous. They can't do anything. They haven't really got an officer corps. So Washington has to do everything, pretty much build everything from scratch. He's been accused of being a micromanager. Well, he had to be, really. He had to be. Everything needed to be done from scratch. He needed to create an officer corps and tell them how to drill men and how to behave themselves, how to act as, for want of a better word, gentlemen. Washington was kind of obsessed with that, with sort of the correct way to conduct yourself and how to be polite and things. So he was very straight-laced. He was very humorless, actually. I don't mean to cast shadow on one of your most important figures, but he was known as being, well, yeah, very humorless. And it's probably well, it's kind of really what you would want in a commander of that stripe. So it's no real criticism. But yeah, he was very strict and authoritarian or disciplinarian. He would have people disciplined quite strongly for sort of disobeying orders. And it seems, though, that was exactly what was needed. He had to whip these guys into shape. And there was even there was a guy, I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a Prussian came over and helped drill the men at one point, helped teach them some good discipline. And again, how to really just, like clean a musket properly, things like this. And the American Army suffers from this sort of thing all the way up to the end of the war. Even by the end, they're still sort of kind of getting their act together in various ways. Like I say, even in the last year, when there's a lot more fighting in the South, again, it's still described that the men haven't even got shoes and things. I don't know why it keeps coming back to that again and again, that some important people, like there's an important general called Greene, Nathaniel Greene, there's letters survive where he sends letters to Congress saying, look, this is ridiculous. We've been asking for bloody shoes for years. Like, why aren't the people that are involved in that, like the office that's responsible for that, why haven't people been fired? Why hasn't it been sorted out yet? What's the problem?
Well,
and so, sorry, go ahead.
That leaves the question of taxation. How did they fund this war? Apparently, they didn't adequately. But how do they get the money? How did they convince the taxpayer to, start to render their, switch their Caesar that they're rendering unto?
All right. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I haven't got a fantastic amount of detail for you on that, other than to say that the Continental Congress sort of were, at least to begin with, were getting their money from each individual state. Each individual one of the 13 colonies sort of had a responsibility to for appropriations of money. But the minutiae of the taxation in the various states and how it ended up in one sort of central place for the Continental Congress to then dole out. I don't know the minutiae of that, I'm afraid. But what I can tell you is that funds were quite short. They didn't have sort of endless money like they seem to now. They couldn't just print more money whenever they needed to, like they do now. For example, getting on towards the end, more towards the middle and the end of the war, but it's a good time to mention it, I suppose, is that the Americans try really hard to get lots of money and resources and help in various ways from France. And Benjamin Franklin goes over there. It was his job for sort of 20 years before this war broke out to be a diplomat in Paris. He spoke French, and he spent many a year in, even before that in England, but then in Paris. Well, he's got a long checkered history as Benjamin Franklin.
But who is he being a diplomat for before the United States is founded? Well, kind of these colonies or something?
Yeah, that's right.
Economic interests, basically?
Yeah, he's like, what would they say? Like I can't remember the exact word, but there's a word for basically like a commerce czar, maybe. That's
lobbyist.
Something like that, yeah. He spent a lot of time in England before hostilities really started to come to a head. He spent years and years in England, and he was because he was famous in his own right. He was sort of a famous writer, and he was sort of an important. He was an important politician, if not on the national level yet, because there is no nation. But within his own state, he was, you know, famous, sort of a leading man. And so he would spend a lot of time in London, and he was sort of considered as, well, yeah, some sort of proto-ambassador. And he loved being sort of the centre of attention and going to parties and things, and just sort of schmoozing with the right people in London, and just constantly lobbying for anything and everything that was in the interests of the American states. Okay. And so when it seems clear that hostilities are quite possibly going to start breaking out, everyone in London wants to know what Benjamin Franklin thinks. What's his position? How does he feel about it? And when it becomes clear that he is sort of a patriot, he's not a loyalist to the crown, he is a patriot, he's kind of drummed out of town, not quite, but he becomes persona non grata straight away. And he's sort of invited to go back to America. He's not really welcome, particularly in London anymore. And so, anyway, after that, he goes to Paris, where he tries, which on paper to begin with you might think would be an impossible task, he tries to get the French monarchy to help the American colonies, the American states, to fight the English monarchy. So on paper you might think that's never going to work. Why would one monarchy undermine another? Ultimately, you would think maybe the French crown would just view the American rebels as just simply that, sort of troublesome troublesome Democrats that would like to see the end of all monarchy. So it is a very difficult job he has, and it's only towards the middle or the end, or after some specific actions happen in America, where it looks like they might have the upper hand, or when Britain lose a very big engagement, it's only really then that the French decide, oh, okay, maybe we might help a bit. And anyway, by the very end of it, the French are helping massively. They've sort of engaged nearly their entire navy all around the world to try and support the English navy. Yeah.
Why did they throw in with the colonies?
So, well, it becomes again, in some respects, a world war. The War of Independence started as just this rebellion against sort of unfair taxes, and it ends up being a world war, really, between Britain and France on some levels, of which the independence of the colonies is not secondary, because it's all about that, but it becomes bigger than that. So by the end, I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but by the end, the French Navy are sort of blockading Yorktown and New York and things, and they're also engaging the British Navy all around the world, in Cairo and in Calcutta and all sorts of places, just to keep the English, just to help the Americans, just to thwart them, because, you know, it's a massive thing. When America does gain its independence and Britain completely gives up its claim, that rewrites the map of the world, doesn't it? It really is quite a terrible blow to the British Empire. And so that's what the French had in mind the whole time. That was their ultimate goal. I don't think they particularly cared about American democracy or American liberty. They cared about thwarting the British.
Okay, so, well, there's got to be one other aspect, not necessarily just the liberty or the sovereignty of the colonies, but the resources or the resource capacity, or having allies with that amount of resources. I'm sure the king's thinking of all the riches that he can more easily access if he's on the side of these colonies, because America is just this rich land ready to be raped by all the royals over there in Europe, right? I mean, it's not just about thwarting the British. There's also a quid pro quo with the Americans. Or is it really just a kind of like a world power kind of?
Yeah, I think more that.
Calculus.
I mean, they don't get much out of it. It's not like the Americans cede lots of land to the French, or give the French lots of money or anything. In fact, it's the other way around. Some people have argued, I have heard it said, it might have been Winston Churchill actually mentioned, that the French end up almost bankrupting themselves in order to do this, because the French Revolution happens in the 80s. I mean, you know, it's 89. to 91, isn't it? I think so. It's fairly shortly after this. And one of the major gripes is that the French economy is sort of falling apart. People are really sort of dying for want of bread and things. It's because the French spent so much money on this.
Well, and their royalty and their aristocrats, but they weren't wise on a lot of levels. But they did spend a lot of their resources on America.
And it comes back to bite them. It's really the same movement in some ways. It's kind of the same intellectual movement that the founding fathers set in motion, which spills out into the French Revolution. They're very similar. Like I said, well, Thomas Paine himself is absolutely involved, saying the same things about liberty and tyranny. It just takes a really weird, horrible, dark path in France, and in America, not so much. But yeah, it's sort of the same intellectual movement. So the thing that the French funded and kicked off in order to try and thwart the British Empire ends up destroying the French monarchy. You can argue. I mean, there's more to it than that. It's a very complicated thing I'm talking about, and distilled it down into just that. But yeah, it really is quite interesting. I think it's funny the way that the Germans in World War I sort of facilitated Lenin going back to Russia, kicking off the Russian Revolution, because they thought it was in their interest at that moment. Well, it ends up Bolshevism ends up annihilating Germany, doesn't it, in the end? So it's funny, you never know what things you can set in motion, how they end up
with allies like these.
Right.
Well, what are some of, just on a just comparing it to the French Revolution? Were there French Revolution gets pretty bloody, right? And there's probably a lot of different reasons why that happens in France and not in America, because the monarchy is in the same land that the revolutionaries are on. If the monarchy was in the colonies, maybe the colonies would have proceeded to do a bunch of executions or something. But there seems to be something a little bit more radical, a little bit more bloody about the French Revolution that doesn't happen in America. What do you chalk that up to? Do you have any kind of ideas of why the Americans didn't go that way, and kind of switched into this constitutional thing in a different way or through a different means than the French did?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great history nerd's question. That is the sort of question that you get two history nerds together and they can argue about that endlessly. Whole books written about why that might have been. And I don't have a brilliant, there's no perfect one answer to it. It's just a very complicated thing. There's a few things I could say about it. One of the things is that the American founding fathers seem to have been well, they really were sort of men of the Enlightenment, people like Jefferson, quite gentle souls, really. I'd love to have had a conversation with Jefferson. He talked to the thing that came out of his heart was the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. That's where his mind was, Whereas if you look at the French Revolution, when it started getting really dark and murderous, you end up with sort of ideologues, people like Marat or Danton or Robespierre. These are sort of murderous ideologues. Very, very different men to Thomas Jefferson, maybe that's one reason. It got dark in the French Revolution for all sorts of reasons. It seems that they were just more extreme.
They were suppressed a lot harder than the American colonies were, according to
well, that's right. Yeah, the American colonies had merely had some unfair taxes. I say merely, there is more to it than that. But they'd suffered under a few unfair taxes, which you could even argue weren't even all that unfair. Whereas the French had been stomped under heel for generations upon generations. Yeah, the French Revolution, although I said earlier that it's sort of part of the same intellectual movement or tradition, they're actually completely different things. Again, so France of the 1780s is very different to the United States of the 1770s. Very different thing. Yeah, the French have been sort of, as I say, exploited or oppressed by their aristocracy for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the things that quite often gets said about the French Revolution is that there was this whole class of aristocrats who people thought were just unworthy. They were sort of degenerate and sort of morally disgusting in some way, and it was just sort of beyond the pale to be ruled by them anymore. So that's quite a different set of circumstances, isn't it, to just having the Stamp Act or sort of you know, like things that went down at the Boston Tea Party. Yeah, it's a whole different kettle of fish. And yeah, well, the French revolutionaries, they were so much more extreme. Certainly after a while, it got more and more extreme as it went on. But, you know, the way they wanted to rework the calendar, they wanted, you know, they really wanted to rework the whole of society.
Everything. Yeah.
The American founding fathers are not really like that. They're not really in that same mold, I don't think. They were looking simply to have representation, at least to begin with. You know, that's far less extreme than what the people like Robespierre wanted.
Okay.
They wanted
it's
to
interesting
do away
because
with all the priests and everything. You know, they would say, "I'm not happy until the last king is strung up by the entrails of the last priest." Things like that. You know, very extreme views. Very, very extreme.
Then they put they invented that rationality religion. They went as far as they could with that. Whereas the American founding fathers are very idealistic. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a very idealistic thing. And their proclamations about the Bill of Rights and the way that they conceive of society is based on really deep philosophical ideas. So there are ideas playing out in both revolutions and in both recreations of society. It's just there's some sort of quality about both the people and the ideas that shape it in these very drastically different directions.
Yeah, I think maybe I didn't express myself perfectly when I said they're ideologues. It wasn't that the American founding fathers weren't ideologues. People like Thomas Paine, very, very idealistic, almost crazily so, to the grave, an ideologue. But I suppose what I mean is that the French version of it is more, I don't know what's the best way to explain it, but just more sort of cutthroat. Maybe that's one way of saying it. Because, as I said a couple of times, it did take a while for the French Revolution to end up in that place where you've got the Committee of Public Security, I think it was called, or the Committee of Public Safety or something, where it's just like about 5 or 6 or 7 guys deciding we're just going to guillotine everyone and everyone in our way. It took a while for the French Revolution to get there, but the American Revolution never went there. And why that is, I mean, yeah, as I say, there's sort of whole books written about why that could have been. And it just seems that there's just a feeling ran a lot deeper for the French. It's a lot, yeah.
Well, so getting back to England or bringing England into the conversation, how does the attitude toward America change in Parliament and within the intellectual class? Not just the crown, but how does Britain kind of do people kind of side with America? Is there arguments there and pressure within Parliament to kind of just reconceive of what the Americas mean to Britain? And
there's a big debate. It's not just that everyone in Parliament is completely for teaching the Yankees a lesson and that they're just ungrateful sons of bitches that need to be put back in line. No, there's a whole there's a whole movement in Parliament that is sort of pro American freedom. Of course, the King himself, George III, is very much against that. And it's this is one of the periods in parliamentary history where a fair amount of some power or some authority at the end of all this, after it's all shaken out and Britain have lost, the authority of the king or of the crown is reduced. So, for example, right now, today in Britain, the monarch, our queen, has hardly any power at all. Hardly any at all. The government writes her speech every year. Every year the Queen gives a speech at the opening of Parliament saying what her government intends to do. That's written for her. Okay. So rubber stamping things and being the head of state and the head of the Church of England and all that sort of thing, it's all written in stone, but her actual power to sort of set policy is almost nil. And that has been the case for quite a while. since well, even Queen Victoria herself had struggles with how much power she could have, how much influence she could have over a prime minister. Now, in the early reign of George the Third, he had a fair amount of power. He was able to sort of suggest things to the leading politicians of the day, suggest things to his prime minister, and he would expect his suggestions to be taken seriously.
Okay.
And it's after the War of Independence where Parliament, in various different ways, the new governments decide, look, we're not really going to listen to the king much anymore. His authority, his power is reduced a fair bit. But I only mention that, I only say all of that to paint the picture that, yes, Parliament wasn't completely against the Americans. There were people, so the main government is a Lord North. For most of, or nearly all of this period, it's Lord North. He had a very long premiership. And when it becomes clear at the end of this at Yorktown, the Americans finally win at Yorktown. That's sort of the final hot action. After the news of that gets back to London, Lord North's government collapses. He has to resign in humiliation. And that's the end of his political career. And the faction was it Lord Shelburne, a couple other people. There's a whole other faction in Parliament that's ready to take over, that were politically against North and his governments, that were sort of committed to sending more and more men and committed to having wars in America. So yeah, there are all sorts of people. Fox, I think. Sorry, go on.
Were the people who replaced Lord North, were they ideologically aligned with the independent movement or the Enlightenment movement that's kind of redistributing power from the kingship back to a more formal, stronger representative government like the Americas set up? Are they ideologically or just kind of strategically? Are they ideologically for the ideas that are happening in America and the government there, or are they more about Lord North is inept and it just doesn't work anymore, and he wasted a lot of resources on something that was a stupid idea, or at least it turned out to be a bad idea?
I think the answer to that is a little from column A, a little from column B. I think that a lot of them were sort of genuinely pro-American independence. But I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what's in men's hearts sometimes, isn't it? Especially when you're dealing with politics, and whether people are on the level, whether what they say they believe in, whether they really do, or whether it's just sort of a pragmatic move because it furthers their career. It's difficult to say. But yeah, I think there were a fair few sort of leading politicians after it seem to have been genuinely for American independence. I mean, same thing happens in not just in the American question, but in sort of home rule in Ireland. You would have Parliament would be split whether the Irish should be allowed to rule themselves or not. Same even goes for sort of home rule in India in the 20th century. The Parliament would be split over the matter. So yeah, it is actually quite interesting because it gets a bit bitter, at least in terms of words. You know, those in Parliament that are sort of pro-American are sort of called out for being traitors and things.
Yeah, that's the other question. Were people hanged or hung for supporting America in England? Was it that extreme? Okay, so even the British didn't go the way of France, like you're on the border, you're off with your head kind of thing. So there's more of a democratic diversity of ideas and argument-based kind of resolution of conflict and decision making in England that's active and that steers them at this time.
Yes. It's all very begrudging, though. I would say that. I would say that the way that George III thought about it, this is before his various periods of insanity, when he realised that the Americas were lost, he never got over that. It was like a profound wound to him. And I think that a lot of people, sort of pro-establishment people in England, felt the same way. It was like this giant continent that's just full of potential. It's full of promise. It's all just lost. We just lost it like that. It's gone. And so that is sort of a terrible open wound. And he never really got over it. He always harboured dreams of taking it back. Well, they tried to, didn't they, in 1812?
And one thing we haven't mentioned is the North, which is present day Canada. What was their involvement? I guess they were. What was Canada's involvement in this? And I guess was England like coming down from the north through Canada and you know, trying to take back America that way? And when the resolution starts making up, where does Canada land on, well, we're next to an enemy state, or was there peace treaties specifically with the government of Canada, or was Canada purely a subject to the crown and did everything that the crown did, and basically was just an extension of Britain?
Yes, no, much more that. So there's no Canada as such. There's two colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, both just complete possessions of the crown. And so, yeah, there's no Canada as such. There's no sort of government of Canada, and you need to worry about the relationship between the government of Canada and the Continental Congress. Don't need to worry about any of that. None of that exists. Yeah, it's just British-held territory. And as for the idea of coming down through Canada to attack America, yes, relatively towards the end or halfway through, I suppose. There is a big English force that comes down the Hudson River. Burgoyne, is it John Burgoyne? Yeah, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne comes down the Hudson River towards New York, towards sort of up through upstate New York down to New York itself. That was the idea. So yeah, at one point that does happen. But yeah, no.
How far do they get?
Burgoyne gets about halfway. They retake Ticonderoga, but then is eventually forced into a surrender. That's actually a really good victory for the Americans at that point. That's one of the points actually where the French sort of prick up their ears and suddenly start taking notice. Like, oh, actually, the American rebels might win. They might do something here. They're not completely inept. They're not going to be completely steamrolled by the British. Maybe we should take seriously the idea of helping them out. It might be worth doing, actually. That's the story. Yeah, the sort of Canadian theatre plays a far smaller role than it did in 1812, for example, where they're sort of key players and everything. Not so much here. Not so much, really, no.
One extra question on that is does the Continental Congress send a delegation to invite the Canadian territories to involve themselves in American independence? Are they ever invited to be a part of the project?
That's a really good question, and my answer would be is I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. I've never heard anything like that. It may be the case someone that really knows this. Sorry.
Were they thought to be all that important at that time to the colonies?
No, not really. No, I mean, so we had the 7 Years' War, where I mentioned before, where a lot of that plays out in the Canadian theatre.
Okay.
General Wolfe and the siege of Quebec and things. But the main 13 colonies, that doesn't include the Canadian ones. Yeah. Okay. The St. Lawrence River sort of marks that boundary. They were never invited to be part of the United States. But it's a very interesting question. Someone that is sort of a true scholar of this, who knows everything inside out. I do like to think I know it fairly well, and have gone over it many times and read around the topic fairly extensively. But I don't know if someone might know that there's a different answer to that. But as far as I'm aware, no, they kind of take a very, very back seat to it. Most of the histories I read, 2 or 3 of the histories I read leading up to this, make no mention of it, really. What the Canadian colonies are sort of doing, or what they think about it. They're just thought of as just sort of staunchly British territory, and there's no real question whether they're that or not after the 7 Years' War, after the sort of French and Indian Wars, it's so called. Hopefully that answers that.
So the Continental Congress, they get involved in this war with the crown, and they got Washington doing their bidding as far as he can do it and doing his thing, getting all these Minutemen into like actually scruffy force that can actually do something on the field. Toward the middle and the end, arcing toward the end, how does the Continental Congress deal with the fact that they might win? What, how do they start to deal with the fact that they might win? That it's no longer a question, but they're arcing toward we're gonna be independent, guys. What now? What next? How do they start to go in that direction when it starts to appear to them that they're going to get their way?
That's interesting. One thing I would say, I suppose, in answer to that would be that it doesn't become clear that they're going to win until fairly near the end. I mean, even the year before the fight. So Yorktown, as I say, the end is the end of the Hot War is 1781, and even in 1780. The Brits are still fighting really hard. There's still lots going on, lots and lots of skirmishes and battles going on all over the place, particularly in the south by that point.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, it doesn't. I don't think the Continental Congress could be confident that they would win until quite near the end. However, when that does become, when they do get there, when that does happen, for example, when Cornwallis, the British general at Yorktown, surrenders, yeah, they on one level, I suppose it's fair to say, sort of can't believe it because it's against the odds. If you asked them in 1775, most of them would have said, well, we wouldn't even dream of asking for independence, let alone fighting a giant continental-sized war and winning. So on one level, I think they're sort of surprised, obviously over the moon, happy, very happily surprised. But on another level, these men, the founding fathers, they're very serious individuals. They're I heard them described as sort of men of destiny in various ways, and they're quite capable. So I don't think they were ever sort of crushed under the weight of their responsibilities. They just start sort of setting up government departments, and they start doing the business of government.
Really?
They just start setting up all the different bureaucracies they need to run a nation. And among the first things they do when George Washington gets back to Philadelphia after the victories. Well, one thing to mention is that Yorktown happens, but the English don't leave New York. They stay in New York. They've still got their base in New York. They don't leave for like another couple of years. It's about 2 more years of political wrangling, diplomatic wrangling of what the final treaty is going to be. So it's actually the very final end, the very, very end, when the last British troops leave New York. It's sort of a long, drawn-out process, that. So it's not sort of this fantastically great day when a treaty is signed by George Washington and by Clinton, who was the English commander at the time, Henry Clinton. There wasn't just a treaty that was just signed on a single day, like the armistice of World War One, say, and then everyone can go home and everyone can start celebrating, moving on with their lives. There was this drawn-out period for sort of 18 months, 2 years, where it's like, is the war going to kick off again? Are the English going to send over more men? Do we need to? Yeah, so it's a little bit of a messy end to it. However,
okay.
When it is finally,
before you get to
sorry, go on. Yeah,
just to clarify that. So the Americans, when kind of hostilities kind of died down, the Americans aren't going to eradicate their enemies. It seems like there's still an affinity or some sort of brotherhood, even though it's tense. They aren't going to try to kill and every single British ally there. They once the hot war ends, even though there's tension, they kind of hold their ground, and it doesn't seem like they want to be very vengeful. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of vengeance. This isn't about vengeance. This is about they just kind of getting their independence and then getting back to business.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair to say. Like I say, they considered it. A lot of Americans considered themselves essentially. They're more English than they are any other European identity. They're their own identity. They're men from Virginia, let's say, and then they're also American.
Yeah.
But there's also a big part of their identity that considers themselves to be English, in the sense that they thought it was a brotherly war. That gets said sometimes. I was reading something the other day that was talking about that some people in America at the time really resented that the French were getting so involved. And even the Spanish get involved a little bit, a tiny little bit towards the end. down in Florida, and a lot of Americans and English were both sort of kind of annoyed that there was sort of, it was meant to be like this internal war between brothers, and we don't really want the French, we don't really want other foreign people getting involved. Not everyone thought like that. Not everyone saw it that way, but some did.
It leads me to the question that I'm sure there's probably at least one scholarly paper about this, but the role of them having a common language, making it brotherly, whereas they're not fighting the French, they're not fighting somebody who's literally speaking a foreign language. They're fighting people who are speaking the mother tongue, and the identity that they have is directly imported just by the way that their language works from England. So that's just a basis in identity and a shared identity that probably has a powerful psychological effect that wouldn't be the case if they were fighting the Spanish or the French, for independence from this really thoroughly lingually foreign force. So I'm just
yeah, I think it's a good point.
The psychology of this.
No, I mean, it does speak volumes, doesn't it? That they weren't intent on sort of murdering every last Englishman that was in America as soon as they could. It wasn't like that. It wasn't as bitter as that. So, for example, the British had their base in New York. The main sort of military base was on Staten Island, actually, and so it was not exactly impregnable, but it was a strong position. And yeah, the Continental Congress decided after Yorktown that there's no need to sort of blockade that. There's no need to try and storm those fortifications and kill everyone inside. No, the political side of it had been decided, and the military side of it had essentially been decided. Okay. So we'll try and come to some diplomatic and political conclusion to this, rather than just kill every last British troop that was there. So again, it does speak volumes. You're quite right that it's not that bitter.
Yeah, and comparing and contrasting it with what happens in France, though the situation's very different. Violence isn't key to this revolution. The military action isn't the foundation of this war for independence. And I'm just thinking a lot about the revolutionaries that we see now in my country, and they're not really even revolutionaries. They show up to protest 11, or they protest at 4 a.m. and they just kind of the Antifa and a lot of the kind of revolutionary rhetoric right now about that centers violence, or a lot of the revolutions that center violence, or that violence is a mean in and of itself. It doesn't seem like violence and military action is all that foundational to the project of America, or even to the birth of America, even though this war is very important. It just seems like once it's over, it's minimum necessary force to get kind of their way, and then they switch right back to a political conflict or a discussion of treaties, and so violence just doesn't seem to be. It doesn't continually go on like the Russian Revolution leading to Stalin, where this constant violence and murder is not a part of the American project and not a part of this particular revolution. It's just interesting to think why that's not so, or that it isn't. I'm very grateful that it's not so, that the blood of the blood that birthed our country wasn't a very vengeful or all that terribly bloody war. Was it? What's the death count of the American?
Right. Well, I mean, compared to sort of the 20th century, the numbers are quite often tiny. One of the bigger battles towards the end in the South. Sometimes there's only like a dozen casualties, or 100 or so casualties. When you look at lists, there's so many battles and engagements that quite a lot of them are small. Sometimes they're big. I mean, Bunker Hill is a relatively big one. When the English take Charleston in South Carolina, at one point there's sort of more than 10,000 men there. But yeah, by and large, it's relatively small numbers. It's all relative, though, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
But yeah, one thing I'd say is that I would say the American violence on the American side. So the raising of militiamen and the making of the Continental Army and the battles that they fought, I think it's fair to say that all of that is a reaction to a British force. You know, you could argue that the British force was a reaction to sort of the tarring and featherings of loyalists. So in all these things, it's very difficult to work out exactly who started it, if you like.
Yeah, or who escalated it to the next level.
But I do think that a lot of the bloodshed that happened was more a reaction to the British than just a bloodlust on the part of the Americans. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair to say. And of course, any comparison to modern day Antifa it doesn't make any sense, because they're just mindless children LARPing, being something important. So they're not anything. They're not revolutionaries or anything, are they? That's just a nonsense. So I think it's fair to say that the
well, just compared to the communist revolutions, the American Revolution is of a completely different stripe and character. And plus that the American Revolution happens pre-Marxism and pre certain other developments, and has its own set. It's a completely different story than what happened in Russia. I understand that, but it just seems like there's a lack of the violence that other revolutions lead to. Even if you look at what happens in post-World War II Middle East, and a lot of the conflicts just around the world when different countries fight for when those men get together to declare their independence, the fallout from that, it has wildly different outcomes, at least with regards to body count, and then the stability of the government that actually comes to be in the wake of that.
No, as we said earlier, it's very, very rare for a revolution or a rebellion like this to end up with a stable government. Very rare. I mean, it is kind of incredible that the American experiment turned out the way it did. I mean, it's incredible. I think it speaks a lot about people like Jefferson and John Adams, people like that, that their intellect, or what they wrote and what they said, were able to keep it all under wraps, to keep it from descending into some sort of insane bloodshed like you see in Libya or something. Yeah, it's incredible. It's brilliant. I mean, it's a great example from history that it is possible. That it doesn't have to descend into that. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking there about when you mentioned the Russian Revolution, one of the things that springs to mind is that sort of their goals. So Lenin's one was basically peace from World War I, peace, bread and land, that sort of thing, and the proletariat being released from the bonds of the bourgeoisie, and that the means of production should pass into the hands of the working man in order to realise a worker's paradise, etc., etc. Well, that's not what the American founding fathers were about. They were about things like property rights. So actually the exact opposite of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks wanted to do away with property rights. Marxists hate property rights, whereas the American founding fathers, that's one of the main things. It was, it's about liberty. It was about the freedom to own your own things. About well, again, the phrase will always come up: taxation without representation. They wanted, if they were going to be taxed, they would like to be represented, at least in whatever body that would be. So yeah, the ultimate goals are very different, but nonetheless, there's nothing. If you were to put money on it in 1775 or 1776, whether whether this experiment was going to turn out to be really a fantastic success and create a nation like the United States, you would never put money on it. That would seem like a crazy long shot. That just seems very, very unlikely. I mean, the most likely thing at that point you would have thought is that the British would send over a large expeditionary force, and all the traitors would be done away with. Yeah. That's why I think, that's why I'm sort of I think the American Revolution is well, I don't want to be too hyperbolic about it, but it's an incredible, amazing thing. I really think it is. I think that the documents that came out of it, like the Constitution, like the Bill of Rights, they're kind of wonderous. You know, I don't I don't want to be too sycophantic to the Americans, but well, I'm just my honest opinion. I think they are wonderful documents, and it would be a real shame. You know, I think it would be a real shame if the American Republic was entirely subverted. Well, unfortunately, it seems like that might be the way we're going.
Well,
But
let's say, yeah, let's don't put your money on it yet, but
okay.
it does seem like there's some questions
Well,
here.
it's funny because I had this sort of notes and things all prepared for sort of going through sort of the chronology of the individual battles and the sort of the ebb and flow of things. But I feel like we've been talking just much more sort of thematically about about it. I wonder if that's what you think. If you didn't want to, you know, sort of know more about the sort of the minutiae of sort of the military history side of things.
Well,
I know it's not
I think
everyone's
that,
cup of
like,
tea.
with regards to just going back and forth from historical data to thematic questions and stuff, when we talk about loyalty and patriotism, I don't know if you want to talk about this or if you read up on Benedict Arnold, but it would be an interesting test case on how he's now cast as a traitor, but a traitor to what? If not everybody was, if it was still split between loyalists and patriots, how did this one man become known as a traitor? What did he betray? Did he betray the ideals? Did he betray, on what level? If you want to venture into that particular story.
Yeah, no, absolutely could do. It's funny actually what different nations put different emphasis on. So I always find it funny, not funny, ha ha exactly, but funny, interesting that the Americans seem to be kind of endlessly fascinated with the figure of Benedict Arnold.
Was he just nobody outside of us? I don't know why he was taught to me as this key figure. You know, it took me a while to get into Eggs Benedict because I always thought it was a traitorous breakfast repast, but you know, I've gotten over that eventually.
I mean, from an Englishman's point of view, it's just sort of a funny, again, not funny, haha, but just sort of a funny character, funny, interesting sort of quirk is the figure of Benedict Arnold. Well, what it was, when the sort of hot war kicked off in 75, 76, the army, this brand new Continental Army, was looking for officers. And so sort of anyone, not anyone, but they were looking for, they would take almost anyone that had good experience, that had any experience in war, in sort of European style war. That's what they were looking for. And so they got guys that had previously been commissioned in the British Army. They got people that had fought in the French Army, people that had fought for the Prussians, things like this. Anyone that they could get that could help their cause. So anyway, Benedict Arnold is one of these. And what he had was, apparently, he cut a dash whilst on horseback. He looked the part. He looked very good. Spit and polish. He was supposed to just physically look like a leader of men. And so anyway, on the back of that, he gets quite a high commission. He's a general, basically. And he felt that he was, for the Americans, this is, and he felt that he'd been slighted over and over again by various things. So, for example, one of the early big important engagements at Bunker Hill, where the British were besieged inside Boston, and the Americans tried to, or did, wheel some artillery up onto Bunker Hill, or actually there was another hill, Breed's Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill should probably be called the Battle of Breed's Hill. But anyway, the Americans got some artillery up there, and the British had to sort of move them out of there, and they did so, but they lost like 1,000 guys in the process. So it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory. Bunker Hill is sort of a Pyrrhic victory for the English. Anyway, more than one time, Benedict Arnold seems to have done sort of great important actions, made the right decision at the right time, and then at the end of it all, when it all shook out, his senior commanders took all the credit, and he got no credit, and that really, really pissed him off, really badly pissed him off. Okay. And there was other things as well. He married a woman who was a sort of a staunch loyalist, and there was something else. There's another reason. There was some. I can't remember what it was. But there was some other reason that Benedict Arnold felt really aggrieved by Congress and by the Continental Army. He'd been passed over for promotion a few times. Things like this. And so anyway, at one point, he relatively towards the end, he's in charge of. He was put in charge of West Point. He was in charge of the fort there at West Point, and he wanted money. He decided that he'd got a one of his men, one of his sort of guys that are in charge of to do with espionage. He'd met up with a British spy, I suppose is one of a better word, and was going to give him, or did give him, all the plans to West Point, and all the information they needed. How many men were there? How many cannons were there? What was sort of the right angle to attack it from, and at what time? He basically completely stabbed
Gave it over.
America in the back really badly, to be quite honest. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I'm not going to defend Benedict Arnold, not for a second. But so that's what he did, because he was promised, what was it, like £20,000 or something stupid, a fantastic amount of money in order to betray West Point and his country. And for whatever reason, he decided now was the time to change sides. And so, but his treachery was found out like almost straight away, like almost immediately. The spy, the espionage dude that he'd given this information to, was caught like almost immediately, and the Americans found out what was going on pretty much straight away. And so anyway, he fled to British lines and was made a general, was like made a brigadier general in the British Army. So he completely changed sides.
Okay.
So it's a clear cut and dry case of a traitor. And to this day, I mean, I think a lot of English people, if they know about Benedict Arnold in any detail, they would think of it as just like well, that's a funny anecdote, that's a funny thing that happened. Whereas Americans, it's like he's a devil, he's a demon, you know. He's like he's one of the worst traitors that there's ever been, as far as the United States are concerned, you know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Everybody's a traitor now in the United States. We're kind of eating each other up. So you mentioned that I disappointed you because I upset your. You had all these notes that we haven't gotten to.
No,
I'm joking. I'm being a little sarcastic there. But we should kind of arc the conversation towards closure for the audience.
Sure.
There's one thing that I interrupted you about earlier on, about halfway through the conversation at this point, when after the battle, that basically the end of the hot war, Washington returns. You were going to talk about how Washington returns, and the first thing that happens with the Congress, or with bestowing upon Washington some sort of honors, or what happens when, how does what's the next step after General Washington gets his victory?
Okay, so there's a great HBO series they made just called John Adams, with Paul Giamatti plays John Adams, and it's great. I think anyway, a little bit too much on Abigail Adams for my liking, but nonetheless it's very good. And they depict actually in that the scene where George Washington is offered the presidency. So, as I say, all the way through the War of Independence, there's no president or anything like that remotely. George Washington is the commander in the field, and of course he's got life and death, power of life and death over his men and things, but there's no president. So when the war is finally won, is there
any hierarchy within the Continental Congress, or is it just by votes? So it's all democratic at this point. There's no head of Congress.
No, not really. No. Actually, no. There is what is it? It's not a speaker, but it's the equivalent of the Speaker of the House of Parliament. I think John Hancock did it for a while. It got passed around a bit. John Adams did it for a while, I believe. There was
the Speaker is basically the guy who, the guy who oversees the proceedings themselves, but not the executive function of making decisions.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, right. So there would be sort of someone like a speaker or a chairman, but they was nothing. They weren't the executive, nothing like that. But when the war's over with, they realise they need all these things. And there's actually a really interesting debate whether they're going to have a king. Like at one point, there's parallels with Oliver Cromwell in the English Civil War, when the parliamentary side win that and King Charles is beheaded. Some people say, well, Oliver Cromwell, you will become king now, right? Obviously, that's how things go. And
Yeah.
of course, Oliver Cromwell scoffed at that idea, wouldn't entertain it for a moment. But a similar sort of thing happens. You know, there are one or two voices that say, whoever our head of state is going to be, are they going to be a king or not? And you know, that argument was relatively easily won. You know, we just had a whole war to get rid of a king, so no. So then, what are we going to have? You know, we want to be a republic. We always had in mind that we would be a sort of a democratic republic. So what are we going to have? Are we going to have like a chancellor, a type of chancellor, or are we going to have,
Prime
you know,
Minister.
what are we going to have? So they decided in the end, they decide they're going to have a president, and they call him sort of the chief magistrate. Often it's called, you know, hail to the chief. I think Washington himself preferred to be called simply the chief magistrate. Now, the idea that what we have now, that you can only be president for 2 terms. So they already had the idea of a term limit of 4 years. Okay, so what happened was George Washington, I'll get into the detail in a minute if you like, of exactly how it went down, but after he was selected to be the first president, the inaugural president of the United States, he had his first term. He was sort of encouraged to have a second term, but after that, he made the decision that it wouldn't be proper, or it wouldn't be right, to have more than 2 terms. But there was nothing was written in stone, nothing at all. That was just what George Washington thought that it should be like that. And so all from that point all the way up to FDR, you would only have 2 terms, and it was FDR that broke that and had 4 terms. And it was after FDR you guys passed a full law through Congress and the Senate that you can only by law have 2 terms. So it was George Washington that started that off. So anyway, after he gets back to Philly, and he doesn't want, George Washington says that he doesn't want the responsibility of being president, of this top, being the chief magistrate. Now, lots of historians have said that's just him being modest. That's just a type of political gambit. That's the thing you should say in order not to piss people off, or in order to not seem really arrogant, you know, in order to deflect any accusations that you really wanted to be king all along, is you pretend you don't want this power. Now, that tradition goes back a long way to Roman times. In fact, Augustus and Tiberius and a lot of the first emperors, they all claimed that the last thing they wanted was to be a chief magistrate, to be the first citizen, to be the princeps sinitas. That was something that was horrible to them, and they would only do it, they would only take on this mantle because that's what everyone else wanted of them. So now, whether that's false modesty or not, we don't know. Historians argue about that a fair bit. I think George Washington, in just my opinion, personal opinion alert here, but I think George Washington was a modest person, a modest man, relatively speaking. I mean, he was hungry for, people are going to say that's completely wrong, because he was a self-publicist and he was hungry for honours and achievements. But I don't think it was a complete liar when he said things like, I don't necessarily want this honour, I'm only doing it because it's the best thing for the country. George Washington's a difficult figure. He is quite a difficult figure. He was quite a private man. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve, put it that way. Apparently he's quite taciturn. He didn't write very long treatises. He didn't deliver massively long speeches. He didn't say exactly what he thought about everything all the time. He was kind of a closed book. And so anyway, just to cut it short a bit, when they said, look, we've had a vote, the Continental Congress has had a vote, and we want you to be president, he sort of, it seems, kind of genuinely reluctantly took it on. And yeah, his inaugural speech was apparently delivered very quietly. Hardly anyone could hear what he was saying. And yeah, there's quite a lot of anecdotes, quite a lot of stories about how he was, although a giant figure, a giant personality, was also quite reserved and humble at the same time. He is a difficult figure to get a hold on. There's some people in history, what you see is what you get. There's no extra layers to them. Everything's out in the open. George Washington wasn't really like that. He quite, I think he had quite a deeper inner life. Certainly didn't wear his heart on his sleeve.
So during his 2 terms, that's when the Continental Congress and all of the founding fathers are actually drafting up the Constitution and what America is and putting all these systems in place. Was President Washington just overseeing um, just kind of affairs of state matters? Was he directing the sculpting of the United States of America as an idea? Was he not really involved in that and was just doing like just basically the business functions of getting things running and maintaining things day to day?
Yeah, no, he was involved. He was accused throughout his entire career of being a micromanager.
Of the drafting and the designing of the articles of the Constitution and of that aspect
No,
of
no, no,
America? No.
no. So not
Okay.
of that. So for his whole career, he was sort of accused of being sort of a micromanager. However, when he came to become president, he realised, like a good officer, a senior officer, that you have to delegate lots of things. You absolutely have to delegate lots of things. There's no way you've bitten off such a huge chunk here that you
Mhm.
can't micromanage it. That's an impossibility.
Hmm.
So he actually changed his style of leadership. I've seen some people say the way you conduct an army is fairly different to the way you conduct a government. and George Washington sort of suffered from that because he was good at running armies. He was very good at that. And he didn't feel comfortable, it seems. I think it's fair to say. I'm not really not going out on a limb to say that he was uncomfortable. I think he was fairly uncomfortable in that seat of being the president, because he had to delegate most things out. And so what we do get in the time of Washington as president and the next president, John Adams, what we really see is the forming of various parties and factions. Kind of famously, almost to the point of cliche, is that you've got Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson bitterly arguing about about the nature of America, about the nature of the army, about the nature of Congress and the Senate, and the nature of the presidency, what it's going to be, what the Constitution will be. Yeah, that is argued about and debated about and fought over non-violently, almost entirely non-violently, for a few years, for quite a few years
Mm.
before the actual Constitution comes out, before it's published.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's sort of quite bitter wranglings. Yeah, for sort of the soul of the newly born America, what
Yeah.
it will be, and people agree that really Jefferson won that that battle of wills between Hamilton and Jefferson. But well, because Jefferson becomes president, he's the third president.
Mhm.
You know, when you're the chief magistrate, you really have got quite a lot of power over the way, setting the tone of things. You know,
Yes. Yes.
and
So
so
at
yeah,
that point, so Washington's basically kind of just a reluctant bureaucrat or head of state kind of figure, while the country's being assembled ideologically through all this staunch debate. By the time that we get to Jefferson, Jefferson has a much stronger hand in sculpting what America is and how it's going to be put together than Washington. Washington, is it fair to say that Washington was just kind of trying to catch up and make sure that this thing kind of, you know, rolls forward while it's put together, and then by the time of Jefferson, he gets to actually kind of cement things a lot more than Washington as
yes,
president.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think if you were to say, if you had to pick out just one or two or three guys that
Mhm.
really sculpted America or sculpted the Constitution, should we say? I think you're looking at Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, maybe a bit of John Adams. But out of all of those, it's really, I would say, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And if you had to say one name, it's Jefferson. I would say that the United States is more a reflection of Jefferson than any other one person.
Wow.
I think that's fair to say. I would stand by that. I would argue with people over that. George Washington, he was the head of the army, and so when they won the War of Independence, it was kind of it's glib to say, and people would say this is wrong what I'm about to say, but it's kind of, he's the obvious choice. It's sort of, he won the war, so he's kind of the obvious choice to be given this chief magistrate's job. And so if he had actually insisted that he wasn't going to do it or refused to do it, then it would have passed to someone else. But it was kind of, whoever's going to win the war gets to be the leader. It sounds kind of silly to say that in a way, but that's sort of the way it was. But the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, they're largely authored by Jefferson. He wrote them, and it's sort of like he also got to be president. It's like they were collaborative works, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It wasn't just Jefferson, but it was largely Jefferson that wrote them. And then sort of as an addendum to that, or as an extra win for him and his career, years later, 16 years later, or no, 12 years later, he also gets to be president. So I would say that the direction, the spirit of the United States and the direction that it went in the early 19th century, Thomas Jefferson is sort of the key player in a lot of that. I think so. Maybe I've exaggerated his importance in my own mind. That's totally possible. Again, if there's a real scholar of the War of Independence who knows better, who would say, actually, no, I think Jefferson owed a lot of it to Madison or something like that. Or they say, no, it was Benjamin Franklin had a vastly more important role to play than I've said there. Then fair enough. But in my mind, from everything I've read and seen, I do feel like if you had to pick out one name, for me it would be Jefferson. I'm fascinated. I'm a massive fan of Jefferson. I think
I
really
picked
important.
up on that a little bit in this conversation, and I think that we should, if you want to, do an episode devoted entirely to Jefferson. Instead of talking about a war of independence or 1812, we talk about one individual and spend time on that. If you like to do that,
I would love to do that. No, I'd love to do that. He's honestly one of my heroes. I've got a dozen or so people from history which I keep returning to, biographies of them, documentaries about them, reading around their life. Jefferson's one of them. Really is a bit of a hero of mine. So I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that.
Let's end the recording now because I have another interview that I have to prepare for.
Okay.
I hope you're satisfied with what we with what we've accomplished today.
Oh no, I am. I've got a whole bunch of quotes and things I didn't get to read
I'm so
out.
sorry.
No. Sorry, I don't mean that as a criticism of you whatsoever, because if given left to my own devices, I would just be chatting away for 4 or 5 hours, just stupid amounts of detail. So it's better that you can just pick my mind and take out the bits that you find interesting. That's probably the better way of doing it. Do you think good?
How's Lotus Eaters going for you?
Oh yeah, it's all good. Yeah, no, we record a new thing every week, and we've got a mini series on the 100 Years' War at the moment. So tomorrow should be part 2 of that, talking about the Battle of Poitiers, where the Black Prince destroyed an entire French army in one afternoon. So yeah, no, it's all going good over at Lotus Eaters. I'm really enjoying it.
That's so fun that you guys are doing that. It's such a great novel thing that Carl set up and that you guys are all pitching in on.
In your video, you described it. I thought it was both brilliant and hilarious. You described it as the Lotus Eaters as what did you say? Cole Benjamin's boarding school in the sky.
Yeah.
I laughed out loud. I don't usually laugh out loud all that much, even if I'm watching stand up. But I laughed out loud when I heard that, and I love it. I think that's great. So yeah, are you doing anything this weekend, or who you took?
No,
interesting.
I'm talking to a conservative. This afternoon, I'm talking to a conservative who embedded herself in Antifa in San Francisco for a couple of years during the I guess 2020, and also in Portland. So we recorded last week, but my machine totally failed on us, and I didn't get a second recording. So we're going to be talking about that and basically kind of chatting through the direction. Maybe we won't. Last time I was really upset about what's going on in America because the way that the media has captured a certain narrative around January 6th and the way that they're positioning themselves with the mandates and everything to do a complete authoritarian swoop is really worrisome to me. And I don't put it beyond them because there's a lot of authoritarianism in the ideology of the left and the Democrats. And then you have the corporatists that are positioning themselves for that. So last week we kind of talked about proper resistance to that rather than just making viral videos of berating school boards, which they're actually going to crack down on because our fucking government's totally turning a authoritarian cheek to these things. But building smaller communities and kind of going back to, this is what I've been thinking about for a while, is just going back to Tocqueville's imagining or rendition of America and the American democracy, which is the ground up, like very community oriented, people starting from the home to the immediate culture and then building up from there. If there's going to be a corrective to top-down progressive corporate weird neoliberal mutation that's going on, it's got to be from people building relationships that aren't mitigated by technology so much.
Yeah, no, it's a terrifying state of affairs. I do think that Chuck and Nancy are monsters. I do think that. And if there's any Americans listening to this, if this ends up in your final edit, I do advise them to read Common Sense by Thomas Paine. It's prescient, I do think, or even American Crisis by Thomas Paine. Even just a synopsis of what he said, it kind of is relevant, I think. Of course, it's a different context, but still, the words are powerful. I would want everyone in the West to read Common Sense.
Well, I got to bounce, but it's always such a pleasure.
Yeah. No, me too. Me too. Give me a couple of weeks or so, and we can do Thomas Jefferson, or whenever you're ready. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely.